On the worst snowstorm night of February, 7 black cars with no plates crawled up the loading ramp behind Halcyon Row Clinic. 8 stretchers came down, 8 men of the Santoro organization, and not one emergency call had been made, because a call meant a record, and a record meant dying a different way. Rafael Santoro stepped out of the last car, snow on the shoulders of his black coat, counting the stretchers with his eyes. At the 7th, he stopped for exactly 1 beat. On it lay the 23-year-old brother he had sworn would never be pulled into this work. 3 cities called him the Cold One. He did not raise his voice that night either, only said to the man in the gray suit coming down the iced steps, "I need the best person in this building." Warren Holloway smiled, nodded, then turned and signed a paper, sending all 8 cases down to Basement 9, the emergency wing shut for years, ceiling lights flickering, 3 staff on duty, the internal line cut. He said it loud enough for the room to hear. "Miss Mercer does love writing reports. Let's see how many lines she gets down tonight." Only recently, Nurse Adeline Mercer had laid 11 pages on the oversight board's desk, accusing him of drawing down the blood reserve. This was not protocol. This was a trap, stamped in red ink, built by a man who had read her file and knew she had no one standing behind her. But there was one line that file did not carry. A few years earlier, the 28-year-old woman tying her hair back with a green medical rubber band had been a trauma surgeon, had stayed nearly 2 days and 2 nights inside the rubble of a collapsed apartment block across the ocean, working under a headlamp in concrete dust. And on the rescue radio that night, she had only one call sign: Sparrow. The elevator doors opened. Adeline looked at the 8 stretchers lined up under that stuttering light and understood 2 things at once. These were 8 lives, and this was a trap built for her to fail in. She had no time for the second one. She pulled her sleeve down over the burn scar on her left wrist, set a stopwatch on the metal counter, and said, in a flat voice the other 2 on shift had never heard, 3 of us, 4 zones. Start the clock. If this story reached you, leave a like, drop a comment, share it with whoever just came to mind, and subscribe to our channel so you don't miss the ones still to come. No one in the basement had time to ask what they had just heard. Adeline had already turned away, pulled open the supply drawer at the end of the corridor, and taken out 4 rolls of colored tape, the kind the hospital used to mark routes for carts, but that no one had ever used to divide an emergency treatment area. She dropped to her knees on the cold concrete floor and pulled the tape into firm, decisive lines. Red, yellow, green, blue, each strip cutting through years of settled dust and leaving a clean streak behind it. The ceiling light above her flickered once, then steadied. She didn't look up. 4 squares appeared on the floor, and in that moment, the basement stopped being an abandoned ward. It became a place with order. The whiteboard propped against the wall was veiled beneath the dull film of years spent forgotten, and Adeline didn't go looking for a cloth. She pulled the sleeve of her white coat down over her palm and wiped it herself, once, twice, until the surface was clean enough to write on. She drew 4 columns. She wrote 4 numbers, nothing else. Marisol Ferraro stood at the far end of the corridor with an instrument tray in her hands, and the 24-year-old woman was trying desperately to keep those hands from betraying her. She failed. The tray slipped from her grip and struck the concrete floor, and the clang of metal through the hollow basement sounded like something had shattered and gone rolling away without ever stopping. Everyone turned. Marisol stood frozen, her face drained white, waiting for the shout she was certain would come. It didn't. Adeline walked over, bent down, picked up each instrument, and placed them back on the tray in exactly the order they had been before, slowly, as though this were the most ordinary thing that had happened all night. Then she put the tray back into Marisol's hands, closed the young woman's fingers around its edge, and pointed toward the square marked in yellow tape. She said only one thing: "Your hands dropped the tray because you're holding it too tightly, and tonight you're going to need both of them. So breathe out and step into Zone 2. Marisol stepped into Zone 2. From that second until morning, she didn't leave her post once. Otis Bramble didn't wait for anyone to assign him a job. The 61-year-old night orderly had walked the halls of that building longer than all the others put together. And he knew one thing no one had ever bothered to put into a procedure manual, that this part of the hospital had never had enough light, even when it was still in use. He went straight down to the security room, opened the steel cabinet, took out the heavy-duty flashlight the maintenance crew had left behind after the last plumbing repair, then came back upstairs and stood in the darkest corner of the basement, where the ceiling lights couldn't reach. He said nothing. He simply switched on the flashlight, angled the beam downward at 45 degrees, and held it there. No one told him to stand in that spot. No one told him that was the place that needed light most. Adeline glanced over once, saw that the beam was already exactly where she had been about to ask for it, and said nothing. Then she began moving down the line of stretchers. She went from one end to the other, without lingering too long over anyone, one hand resting on a wrist, the other holding a small examination light, her eyes moving over field dressings tied by people who knew how to tie a bandage, but didn't know how to treat what lay beneath it. She called out each priority, and the other two recorded them. Her voice was so level that anyone listening from the hallway might have thought she was reading from an inventory list. Stretcher 1, blue zone. Stretcher 2, yellow zone. Check every 5 minutes. Stretcher 3, red zone. Absolute priority. Stretcher 4, green zone. Stretcher 5, red zone. Stretcher 6, yellow zone. Stretcher 7, red zone. And at stretcher 7 she paused 1 beat longer than she had at the others. Not because she knew who was lying there, but because the number beneath that person's wrist wasn't like any number she had read before. Stretcher 8, blue zone. She wrote everything on the whiteboard, 1 line beneath each column, her letters large and square, the handwriting of someone who had written on surfaces far worse than this one. Then she set the marker down. The other two stood watching her, waiting for the next order, and they had begun to believe they might survive the night, because the woman standing in front of that whiteboard seemed to know exactly what had to be done, and exactly what order it had to be done in. Adeline turned to Otis. She told him to go downstairs, open the blood storage room, take every unit of O negative they had, and bring it up before she had to call for him a second time. Otis nodded, handed the flashlight to Marisol, and disappeared down the corridor. He moved faster than his age should have allowed. Adeline turned back to the board, marker already in her hand to write the next line. 30 seconds later, footsteps came back toward them, and they came back far too soon. Otis Bramble stood at the mouth of the corridor. He wasn't carrying anything. Both of his hands were empty, and he couldn't get a single word out. Adeline didn't ask again. She set the marker down on the edge of the board, walked past Otis without looking at him, and headed down the corridor at a pace no faster than usual, because there was something in the way the man stood there that told her running wouldn't change anything. The blood storage room door at the end of the corridor was already open, and inside, the specialized refrigerator stood wide open as well, its interior indicator light still glowing, the fan still running, the temperature still correct, everything working perfectly, like a machine that had been carefully maintained. The shelves were bare, not low, not short, bare, so completely empty that the steel rack still showed fresh wipe marks, as though someone had removed everything and then carefully cleaned up behind themselves. Adeline stood in front of the open refrigerator for exactly 3 breaths. On the first, she saw the inventory sheet taped to the inside of the door, still there, clearly listing the number of units that were supposed to be inside. On the second, she saw that the lock hadn't been forced. And on the third, she understood everything at once. She understood that the 11 pages she had placed on the oversight board's table had never been ignored, had never been pushed to the bottom of some stack of paperwork. They had been read very carefully, line by line, by the exact person she had written about. And when that person finished reading, he had done precisely the thing her report had taught him how to do more neatly. She didn't say it aloud. She didn't say anything at all. She closed the refrigerator door, and the soft sound of the magnetic seal drawing into the steel frame was faint, ordinary, the sound of a piece of equipment still doing exactly what it was meant to do inside a building where nearly everything else had failed. Otis was still standing in the doorway. He opened his mouth as if to say something, perhaps an apology for something that wasn't his fault, and Adeline moved past him before the sound could take shape. She walked back up the corridor, and this time she moved faster than she had on the way down. Marisol saw her returning and stepped forward, waiting to hear a number. Adeline gave her none. She picked up the board eraser, and she erased. She erased everything. 4 columns, 8 lines. Everything she had just written in the square. Steady handwriting of someone who had written on surfaces far worse than this one. All of it disappeared beneath one sweep of her hand, then another, until the whiteboard was blank again, exactly as it had been when she first cleaned it with the sleeve of her coat. Marisol looked at the empty board, then at Adeline, then at Otis, and no one explained anything to her. Adeline picked up the marker and started over from the beginning, but this time the order wasn't the same. Stretcher 3 was no longer first. Stretcher 5 had been moved down. 2 names were pulled to the very top and circled, and beside each of those names she wrote a single letter that neither of the other 2 understood. She wrote quickly, without pausing once, without erasing once, as though this second board had already existed inside her mind, and she was simply copying it down. When she finished, she stepped back half a pace and looked at it only once, and in that half step there was something very close to acceptance, the kind a person acquires only after losing enough times to know exactly how much they have left. Then she turned, walked straight to the backup supply cabinet in the corner. An old pressed wood cabinet no one had bothered locking, because it held nothing but cheap things, and began pulling open the drawers one by one. First drawer, expired gauze. Second drawer, empty specimen tubes. Third drawer, yellowed printer paper. She pulled open the bottom drawer, the one closest to the concrete floor, and her hand stopped. Inside, beneath a thin layer of dust, sat a small square cardboard box with its factory seal still intact, the kind of box anyone searching for something valuable would shove aside to reach whatever was behind it, because the entire box cost less than a single unit of blood, because it contained nothing more than rapid blood typing test strips, something so cheap no one had bothered to steal it. Adeline lifted the box with both hands. She brushed the dust from the lid with her thumb. Then she carried it to the metal table and set it down beside the clock that was still running, and the other two stared at that small cardboard box, sitting in the middle of the basement, without yet understanding that it was the only weapon they had left for the night. Adeline didn't explain the box to the two people in the basement. She broke the seal with her fingernail, counted the test strips inside with the tip of her index finger, and once she knew exactly how many she had, she left the box where it was and walked straight into the corridor. 7 of Santoro's men were standing along the wall outside, the same men who had held their positions there since the last stretcher was wheeled in. No one sitting down, no one leaning back against the wall, their coats still wet with snow and their hands still tucked into their pockets. They looked up when she came out, and in that first moment, they regarded her the way men like them always regarded medical staff, waiting for a number, waiting for someone to tell them that everything was being handled. Adeline didn't say that. She stood in the middle of the corridor with both arms hanging straight at her sides and told them exactly what they had. There wasn't a single compatible unit of stored blood left anywhere in the building. Not that they were running low. There was none. 2 of the 8 people lying inside wouldn't make it until morning without blood, while the other 6 might. The only option left was to take blood directly from one person and give it to another, right here, tonight. She paused for one beat, then said the part she could easily have left unsaid. This wasn't protocol. It wasn't written in any procedure posted on any wall in that building. In a normal facility, blood would be screened through multiple stages over the course of many hours before anyone ever touched it. All she had tonight was one box of rapid blood typing strips and her own eyes. There were risks she couldn't eliminate, and she wasn't going to stand there and lie to them by pretending she could. This was what people did when there was nowhere left to go and they knew exactly how close they were to the end of the road. Then she gave them the last part. Anyone who didn't want to do it could step to the right now, and she wouldn't ask a second time, wouldn't write anyone's name down anywhere, and no one in that basement would ever know who it had been. The corridor went silent. The light at the far end flickered once, and no one turned to look at it. 7 men remained exactly where they were, and not one of them stepped to the right. The first man to step forward was Silvio Beretta. The 58-year-old advisor had stood beside 2 generations of Santoro bosses for 30 years, and in those 30 years he had never allowed anyone to touch him. Not a doctor, not a barber, not even a tailor taking his measurements, because in his line of work, allowing a stranger to stand too close for too long was the kind of habit a man got to make only once. He undid the cufflink on his left wrist, rolled his shirt sleeve up twice, then a third time, and held out his arm in front of the woman standing in the middle of the corridor, who wasn't even 5 feet 5 inches tall. He said nothing. He simply looked straight into her eyes and waited. After Silvio, the second man stepped forward, then the third, then the entire line, and in a span so brief that Marisol, watching from the doorway, barely had time to understand what was happening. 7 hard-headed men from an organization that 3 cities didn't dare name aloud had formed a neat line along the corridor wall, sleeves rolled up, waiting their turn in exactly the order a nurse had assigned them. Adeline tested them one by one. She cleaned a fingertip, pricked it, placed a drop onto the test strip, read the result beneath the beam of the flashlight Otis had handed back to her, then wrote a letter on the back of the man's hand with a marker, and moved on to the next. Her hand trembled very slightly as she held the test strip, and Silvio, standing closest to her, noticed. He looked down at the thin shoulders of her white coat, saw her breath turning to white mist in the cold basement air, and understood that the trembling came from the cold, not from fear. When she reached the fourth man, Adeline stopped, read the strip a second time to make certain, then circled the letter on the back of his hand. When she reached the sixth man, she did the same. She looked up at those two men and told them to come with her. The other 5 were to stay exactly where they were and not go anywhere, because she might need them before morning. The 2 men followed her inside, and when Adeline turned to lead them toward the 2 stretchers circled on the board, she passed the western corner of the basement, the one place Otis's beam didn't reach and the ceiling lights couldn't touch, and there she saw another stretcher. It was pushed close against the wall at a slight angle, the way people shove something quickly into a hidden corner to clear a path for the things that need to move first. It had been there since the vehicles stopped outside the loading ramp. No one had pointed to it. None of the 7 men in the corridor had mentioned it when they formed their line and rolled up their sleeves. Adeline stopped. She told the 2 men to continue into the red zone, and she remained alone in that corner. On the stretcher lay someone very young, younger than anyone else in the building, wearing a heavy coat of the kind people wore when they had to sit for long stretches in a car during winter, and tucked into the breast pocket was a car key attached to a worn blue plastic tag. Adeline placed 2 fingers against his wrist. She kept them there longer than necessary, far longer than she had when doing the same thing with the other 8, not because she still doubted what she already knew, but because there were certain things a person who had once done this work understood should only be done once, and should be done completely. Then she lifted her hand away. She didn't call anyone. She didn't ask anyone to come confirm it, because there was no one in the building that night with the authority to confirm anything. And even she no longer had the right to sign any document with legal meaning, wasn't permitted to record a time, wasn't permitted to record a name, wasn't permitted to do any of the things someone holding the license she had once held would have been allowed to do. All she could do was pull the gray blanket on the stretcher upward. She did it with both hands, slowly, keeping the edge straight, smoothing it once across the shoulders, the way someone might straighten a blanket over a sleeping person they didn't want to wake. Then she stood upright, walked back to the whiteboard, picked up the marker, and in the lower right corner, separate from the 4 columns she had drawn, she wrote down a number. Just one number, no name, no symbol, no letter beside it. She set the marker down and went back to work, because 2 men were waiting in the red zone and 5 more were still standing in the corridor with their sleeves rolled up. Otis Bramble stood exactly 3 steps from the stretcher in the western corner. He had been in that exact position from the moment Adeline stopped, and he was still there when she walked away. The beam in his hand hadn't shifted by even a single degree. It was still angled downward at 45 degrees toward the red zone, exactly where it had been pointed from the beginning, exactly where she needed it to remain. He didn't turn his head. He didn't look toward that corner even once. Not when Adeline placed her fingers on the wrist of the person lying there. Not when the blanket was drawn upward. Not when that number was written in the corner of the board. The arm holding the flashlight remained steady, and someone would have had to stand very close to notice that his knuckles had gone white from how tightly he was gripping it. Marisol ran past him twice during that time and noticed nothing. From that moment until morning, Otis Bramble didn't say another word. He still handed over instruments when asked. He still shifted the beam to the right when Adeline tapped 2 fingers against the edge of the table. He still stayed exactly where he was whenever no one needed him, but he didn't speak. And in a basement where the other 2 people were racing against what they didn't have enough of, no one noticed that the man holding the light had stopped making a sound. The direct transfusions for the 2 men in the red zone were halfway underway when the monitor beside stretcher number 7 made a different sound. It wasn't the frantic alarm people were used to hearing in movies, but a very small change in rhythm, a silence slipping between 2 steady beeps, a silence that lasted longer than it should have, and Adeline had already turned her head before the second beep had time to fail to come. She released the clamp in her hand onto the tray and crossed the basement in 3 steps. The entire room seemed to stop with her. The man lying in the red zone donating blood lifted his head. Marisol froze with a roll of gauze in her hands. In the corridor, the remaining 5 men heard the sudden silence inside and moved up to the doorway, but none of them crossed it. Every one of them stopped exactly at the colored tape line she had laid across the concrete floor, because over the past several hours they had learned that those lines meant something. Adeline placed 2 fingers against the neck of the person on stretcher number 7. She held them there for exactly 1 beat. Then she said, her voice still level, that Marisol was to come in, stand on the right, and count out loud. Marisol ran in. Otis lowered the beam to 40 degrees, then 30, and held it there, and from that second onward, his arm followed every movement of Adeline's shoulders, as though he had worked beside her for years instead of one night. Adeline began. She didn't say anything else. Only two sounds remained in the basement, Marisol's counting and Adeline's own breathing, and both followed a rhythm no one in the room dared disturb. Marisol reached 30, and her voice began to rise. On the second round, she started counting faster than Adeline's hands were moving, and Adeline tapped one finger against the edge of the stretcher, a single tap, and Marisol slowed down. By the third round, she was counting in rhythm again. By the fourth, the monitor still hadn't changed. By the fifth, Marisol stopped counting. She stood there with both hands still exactly where Adeline had told her to place them, and she said she couldn't do it. She said it very softly, almost nothing more than breath pushed into words, that she was sorry, that she had been out of school for only a little over a year, that she had never been in a room like this before, that she couldn't do it, truly couldn't do it. Tears were already running down both sides of her face, and she didn't know she was crying. Adeline didn't stop. She didn't turn toward her. She didn't offer a single word of comfort. She didn't say that Marisol was doing well. She didn't say everything was going to be all right, because she had stood in too many rooms to know that words like those were spoken to make the person saying them feel better, not the person hearing them. She said only one thing, short and hard, without looking at Marisol as she said it. He doesn't need you to be good. He needs you to count. Marisol stood still for 2 seconds. Then she drew in a breath, and she started counting again. She began at 1, louder than before, slower than before, exactly on rhythm, and she didn't leave that position again until morning. 6th round, 7th round. On the 8th, Adeline told Otis to shift the light slightly to the left, and he moved it before she finished the sentence. On the 9th, one of the 2 men donating blood in the red zone suddenly sat upright and had to be held down by the man beside him, and neither of them said a word. On the 10th, Adeline changed hands. On the 11th, nothing changed. On the 12th, Marisol reached 23 when the monitor gave a beep. Then another. Then a third, closer to the second than the second had been to the first, and the rhythm returned, uneven at first, then gradually steadier, then fully steady, and the most ordinary sound in all of medicine filled basement 9, like something no one in that room had ever imagined they could be so grateful to hear. Marisol stopped counting. She raised the back of her hand and wiped it across her face once, then lowered it and stood straight again. Otis held the beam in place for another 10 seconds, before slowly lifting it. Outside the doorway, the 5 men standing at the colored tape line didn't come in and didn't cheer. They simply looked at one another once, then stepped back to their places along the corridor wall, and one of them had to put a hand against the wall to remain standing. Adeline stepped half a pace back from stretcher number 7. She cleaned her hands, checked the line again, wrote 3 lines on the whiteboard, then turned back to the red zone to finish what she had left halfway done, because 2 men were still lying there with tubing inserted into their arms, and no one was allowed to forget them. On the metal table in the middle of the basement, the stopwatch was still running. It had been running ever since the elevator doors opened. Through everything that had just happened, no one had touched it. The red zone had been stable for more than half an hour when Adeline turned toward the yellow zone to make the monitoring round she had promised herself at the beginning of the night. Stretcher number 2 sat at the outer edge of the square marked in yellow tape, and the man lying on it still hadn't fully regained consciousness since he was brought in. For the past several hours, he had been the only patient who had asked nothing of her, except that she write down a few numbers each time she passed. Adeline bent over him, one hand lifting his wrist to check his pulse, the other holding the small examination light. She had made the same movement so many times that night it no longer required conscious thought. Then the fingers beneath her hand moved. They closed around her wrist, not tightly, almost without any strength at all, but they closed and stayed there. Adeline looked up. The man's eyes were open, barely more than a narrow slit, and there was no way to know whether he could see anything, no way to know where he was in that half-formed place between unconsciousness and waking that she had seen in far too many people. He tried to speak. The first time, no sound came. The second time, 2 syllables came out of his dry throat, distorted and so low that no one would have heard them if the basement still held the noise of an hour earlier. But now the basement was quiet, and Marisol in the yellow zone heard them, and Otis, standing 4 steps away with the flashlight in his hand, heard them too. Sparrow. Adeline went completely still. She didn't pull her hand away. She didn't move. She remained exactly as she was, one hand still caught in the hand of the man on stretcher number 2. And for those 2 seconds, something passed across her face and disappeared. Something Marisol would think about many times in the months to come and still never find a name for. 2 seconds. It was the only pause Adeline had allowed herself since the elevator doors opened onto that basement. And both people who witnessed it understood that, because this woman hadn't stopped for even a single beat when the monitor beside stretcher number 7 went silent, hadn't stopped when she stood before an empty refrigerator, hadn't stopped even in the western corner where she had pulled a blanket upward with both hands, but she stopped for those 2 syllables. Then she leaned closer and answered. She spoke so softly that Marisol heard her only because she was standing on the side where the air from the ventilation fan carried the words back toward her. Adeline said that no one had called her that in a very long time, and that for now, he needed to lie still. The man on the stretcher tried to open his eyes wider. His fingers tightened around her wrist, this time with strength, a small amount of strength drawn from somewhere at the very end of what he had left, and he tried to continue. His mouth opened. Something began to form in his throat, a short sound that seemed like the first word of a much longer sentence, and the entire basement had gone quiet to hear it. It never came. His hand loosened and slipped from her wrist, falling against the edge of the stretcher, and his eyelids closed. The monitor beside him didn't change rhythm. The readings remained within the range she had recorded the last time, and Adeline checked everything again in less time than it would have taken to reread a single line of writing. He had only passed out. She placed his arm back exactly where it had been, pulled the edge of the blanket up across his chest, wrote 2 numbers in the yellow zone column on the whiteboard, then turned and walked toward stretcher number 4 in the exact order she had set for herself on this round. She didn't say anything else. She didn't explain anything to anyone. Marisol watched her walk away, then turned to look at Otis, and the old man holding the flashlight didn't look back at her. He simply raised the beam to follow Adeline's steps as he had done all night. But this time, the hand holding the light moved 1 beat slower than it had every time before. Warren Holloway came down to the basement with a stack of papers tucked beneath his arm. He had printed them in advance, printed them on the 4th floor while people below were still tearing open rolls of gauze, and he had printed 3 copies, because years of experience had taught him that 1 copy was for filing, 1 was for keeping, and 1 was for placing on the table directly in front of someone right there on the spot, before they had even had time to wash their hands. He had pictured this scene on the way down. He pictured a basement drowning in voices, instruments scattered across the floor, a nurse standing in the middle of it with no idea where to put her hands, a young woman barely out of school crying in some corner, and somewhere inside that chaos, just enough evidence to put 1 sentence into the official record, a sentence stating that the night shift had failed to control the situation, and that the person in charge of the shift was responsible. The elevator doors opened. He took 1 step forward and stopped. Across the concrete floor beneath his shoes ran 4 straight lines of colored tape, dividing the basement into 4 clearly marked squares. The dust wiped clean along each one, and inside every square stood a hastily cut piece of cardboard bearing a single letter. Nothing was lying on the floor. Not 1 roll of gauze had been left scattered anywhere. Instrument trays were arranged in rows across 2 tables, pushed together, every tray facing the same direction. The night orderly, whose name Holloway had never once bothered to remember, stood in the darkest corner with a heavy-duty work light in his hand, holding its beam at a downward angle, silent. The young woman fresh out of school wasn't sitting in a corner crying. She was standing inside the yellow square, recording readings on a clipboard, and she didn't look up when the elevator doors opened. In the corridor, 5 men stood along the wall with their sleeves still rolled to the elbows, and not one of them crossed the colored tape line. And on the whiteboard propped against the wall, the board Holloway knew had been abandoned for years. 4 columns had been drawn by hand. There were 8 rows. There were numbers written over older numbers with every new round of checks. And all 8 names on that board were still inside the section reserved for the living. Warren Holloway stood there longer than he had intended. He was a man with a talent for walking into a room and knowing immediately who owed what to whom. But he couldn't read this room. He recovered his voice and said that he needed a report on the allocation of resources during tonight's shift, that he needed it before handoff, and that several decisions made down here would have to be explained in writing. Adeline didn't turn around. She was standing inside the red square, both hands working, and she answered without taking her eyes off what her hands were doing. She said the O-negative blood supply was empty, that if he was going to stand there, he could call the 4th floor and arrange a transfer from another facility, that the 2 people in the red zone needed 4 units before shift change, and that if he couldn't get them, he needed to tell her immediately so she could find another way. Then she added 1 more sentence in exactly the same tone. If you aren't going to do that, step back from the red line, because you're blocking the light. The entire basement went silent. Marisol stopped writing. Otis didn't move the beam by even a single degree. In the corridor, the 5 men didn't move, though one of them turned his head slightly to get a better look. Warren Halloway stood on the strip of red tape and looked down at his own feet, as though he had only just realized he was standing on something. He stepped back half a pace. He opened his mouth, and in that moment, he had 4 or 5 sentences to choose from. The kind of sentences a man in his position had always used to take control of a room again, but every one of those sentences had been designed for a room in chaos, and this room wasn't. None of them fit. He tucked the stack of papers back beneath his arm, and suddenly that stack seemed absurdly thick in a place where everything else was being put to use. He turned, stepped into the elevator, and pressed the button. The doors closed before he managed to say anything. Adeline finished what she was doing with her hands. Then she walked to the metal table in the middle of the basement, picked up the stopwatch, and pressed stop. She looked at the number on its face for exactly 1 beat, then slipped it into the pocket of her white coat, and no one in the basement asked her what that number was. The fire door to the stairwell at the far end of the corridor never closed quietly, but this time it opened with almost no sound at all, and the 5 men standing along the wall turned at the same moment, then immediately straightened. Rafael Santoro stepped into the corridor. The snow on the shoulders of his coat had melted into a dark streak running down from the collar, and he didn't take the coat off, didn't brush it away, didn't raise a hand to touch anything on himself. He walked past his 5 men without looking at any of them, without asking a single question, without stopping to hear a report. He stopped at the doorway leading into the basement, and he counted. Anyone watching could see him counting, because his eyes moved from left to right, pausing very briefly at each stretcher before moving to the next. And through all of it, his face gave no one anything to read. 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8. Silvio Beretta stood half a step behind his left shoulder, the sleeve of his left shirt still rolled up because no one had yet thought to lower it, and he murmured a number. 8. Then he added that all 8 were still here. Raphael didn't answer. He stepped across the colored tape line at the doorway and went inside. He walked straight ahead, without looking at the whiteboard, without looking at the 2 tables pushed together, without looking at the man holding the light in the dark corner. He went directly toward the stretcher inside the red square, the 7th one from the beginning of the row, where a very young man lay with an IV line in his arm and a monitor beside him giving off steady beeps. Adeline was standing there. She was working, both hands occupied, and she didn't look up. She told him to stop. She said this was the red zone, that the person in the red zone had already been brought back once, and she didn't want there to be a second time, so he needed to step back behind the colored line and stand there. She said it in exactly the same voice the entire basement had heard her use with the man in the gray suit who had stepped into the elevator not long before. No higher by even half a note. Not one unnecessary word. Not one word altered for the sake of who she was speaking to. Rafael Santoro stopped. Then he stepped back. On the first step, the heel of his shoe struck the concrete with a short, dry sound. On the second, he was completely outside the red square, both toes behind the tape line, and he stopped there. He didn't say anything. He didn't ask about the condition of the person on stretcher number 7. He didn't turn his head to look for someone else to ask. He stood behind the colored line with both arms hanging straight at his sides, and he watched. No one in the basement moved. Marisol stood in the yellow square with a clipboard in her hand, and she forgot she was holding a pen. Otis didn't shift the beam by even a single degree. Out in the corridor, the 5 men standing along the wall looked in, and not one of them had ever seen this before. Not in this building, not at the docks, not in any room where they had ever stood guard for that man. Silvio Beretta was the only one who stepped forward. He came to stand beside his boss, just behind the colored tape line, and he looked down at it, a cheap strip of plastic stuck to the concrete floor of an emergency ward that had been abandoned for years. Then he looked at Raphael. Then he looked at the woman standing 4 steps away. The woman before whom he himself had rolled up his sleeve not long ago. The woman who wasn't even 5 feet 5 inches tall, bent over a stretcher and completely unaware that the entire basement had just stopped breathing because of one sentence she had spoken, without even bothering to lift her head. Silvio had stood beside 2 generations of leaders in this organization for 30 years. He had learned how to read a room before entering it, how to know who would sit down first and who would stand first, how to watch a handshake and know how long it would hold. Tonight, for the first time in those 30 years, he stood in the middle of a room and didn't understand what had just happened inside it. 3 days later, in a glass-walled room on the top floor of the administrative building at Dock 12, a man named Curtis Ballard lowered himself into the chair across from Rafael Santoro and tried to smile. He ran a stevedoring labor company. He had eaten lunch with Raphael's father many times over the course of his life, and he had prepared 3 different stories depending on which direction the meeting took. Raphael didn't ask a single question. He pushed a file across the table, turned it so the other man could read it properly, and sat in silence. Curtis Ballard opened the file. The first page was a reconciliation of the dockworkers' accident insurance fund for the last 4 quarters. Money collected and money paid out. 2 columns that failed to match on every single line. The second page was a list of 17 people who had filed claims and been told that their paperwork was invalid. The third page contained his wife's name, the name of a vacation house by the lake, and the date the purchase agreement had been signed. He turned to the 4th page and stopped. And he didn't turn another. Raphael spoke. He didn't raise his voice, didn't lean forward, didn't make any of the gestures a man about to threaten someone usually made. He only described what was going to happen, and he described it in the present tense, as though he were simply reading back something that had already taken place. By this afternoon, the licensing board receives 3 complaints from 3 sources with no connection to one another. Tomorrow, the 2 insurance carriers your company uses both send termination letters, and both cite the same clause. Your bank calls in your outstanding loan, and no one there explains why. Sometime this week, you call 4 people you've always called when there's trouble, and all 4 of them let the phone ring. You spend a few days wondering why. Then you understand. By the end of the month, no one at this dock signs another contract with the name Ballard on it, and that name doesn't disappear. It stays exactly where it is in everyone's records. People simply stop saying it out loud. Curtis Ballard put both hands flat on the table and said he would give it back. He said he would return all of it, within the week, with interest, that this had been a misunderstanding about cash flow, that Raphael's father would understand. Raphael stood. He buttoned his coat again from the bottom upward, leaving the final button undone the way he always did, and looked down at the man still sitting there. He said that the 17 people on that list had worked with their hands every day for years, in exchange for a piece of paper promising that if those hands ever failed them, someone would take care of them. Then he gave Curtis Ballard the last sentence. You still have both of your hands. That's the part I'm leaving you. He walked out of the room. The door closed behind him. Curtis Ballard remained in that chair for a very long time afterward, the file still open to the 4th page in front of him, and the secretary who passed the room twice saw that he still hadn't moved. Out in the corridor, Silvio Beretta walked on his boss's left, half a step behind, exactly where he had walked for 30 years. Raphael went 4 or 5 steps before stopping at the top of the staircase. He spoke to Silvio, his voice no different from the one he had used inside the room. The woman in the basement that night. I want to know who she is, where she came from, where she was before she ended up at that clinic, and why someone capable of doing what she did is working the night shift in a place like that. Silvio asked how far he wanted him to go. Raphael said everything. Then he started down the stairs, and Silvio remained on the top step for 1 beat, because in 30 years he had received many orders from that man, but never once an order concerning someone who owed this organization nothing. Silvio took 3 days, and when he came back, he didn't bring a handful of loose papers. He placed a thick file on the table, tied with cord, and he remained standing beside it, instead of sitting in the chair across from Raphael the way he always did. Raphael untied the cord. The first page was a copy of a surgical license issued by the state of Illinois, with a small portrait photograph in the upper left corner, showing a face much younger than the one he had seen in the basement, and across the entire page ran a diagonal stamp bearing 2 words, license revoked. The revocation date was printed in the lower corner. The second page was the ruling of the state medical board, 3 pages long, and in the section explaining the grounds was a sentence written in the kind of language people use when they want to conclude a matter without having to tell the story behind it. It stated that the subject had performed an invasive procedure outside the scope of authorized practice and without valid consent. There was no description, no context, only the conclusion and the punishment. The 4th page was the hearing transcript. Raphael read it from beginning to end, and he slowed down when he reached the second half, because throughout the entire record, in every place reserved for the words of the person under review, the clerk had written only 1 word: silence. They asked whether she had anything to present, and the record said silence. They asked whether she wished to offer any mitigating circumstances, and the record said silence. They asked one final time, before the vote, whether she understood the consequences of refusing to defend herself, and the transcript recorded that the subject answered yes, then recorded silence. No attorney. In the section for legal representation, the box was blank. The next page was a printout of an old newspaper article, yellowed inside the archive file, and the headline stretched across the top had been written by someone who knew exactly what they were doing, a headline calling her the woman who believed she had the right to decide who was allowed to live. Beneath the article was a photograph taken from a distance. She was standing on the steps outside the courthouse, wearing a coat that didn't suit the weather. A thin folder tucked beneath her left arm, and there was no one else around her in the frame. No family, no colleagues, no one walking beside her. Raphael looked at that photograph longer than he had looked at all the previous pages combined. The pages that followed were payroll records. 4 years working as a nurse, 3 different facilities, and every move came with a salary lower than the one before it. A lease for an apartment on the south side of the city. A handwritten note from Silvio in the margin saying that she had taken extra weekend shifts for 2 straight years and hadn't taken a single vacation day. Near the end of the file was a short entry Silvio had marked with a small star, and nothing more. It stated that all communication recordings from the rescue operation that year were currently held in the archives of the International Coordinating Organization under restricted seal, and that according to archival policy, access could only be granted upon application by the person directly involved. Beside that line, in parentheses, Silvio had added that no application had ever been filed. Raphael read to the final page. He closed the file, placed both hands on top of it, and said nothing. Silvio waited. On the way there, he had prepared 3 different directions for his report. He had already thought through what he would say if his boss asked about motive, what he would say if his boss asked whether someone had paid her to be in that basement that night, what he would say if his boss asked whether anyone might be using her to gain access to the organization. Raphael asked none of those questions. After a while, Silvio spoke. He said that in 30 years he had read the files of a great many people, and almost every time he had been able to find their price. For some it was money, for some it was a debt, for some it was a name they were afraid to hear spoken aloud. Then he said that with this woman, there was nothing. He said, "No one bought her, sir. She was abandoned." Raphael kept both hands resting on the file. Beyond the glass, night had fallen long ago, and he remained sitting like that for a very long time after Silvio had left the room. There was an all-night diner across the street at an angle from the South Bus Terminal, the kind of place where the vinyl seats were torn along the edges and coffee was poured without anyone having to ask. Adeline sat at the second table from the window, still wearing her white coat beneath a heavy overcoat, with a plate of cold eggs in front of her that she had eaten only halfway. She always sat here after the night shift, because the bus heading toward her neighborhood didn't run until after daylight, and because no one in this diner ever asked her any questions. Rafael Santoro sat down in the seat across from her. He didn't ask whether he could. The waitress came over, looked him up and down once, then turned away without bringing another cup. Adeline set down her fork. She didn't look surprised, and that made him study her for 1 beat longer. He said that all 8 of them had made it, that the youngest among them had been able to sit up since yesterday. Adeline nodded once and said she knew that she had called the hospital they had been transferred to and asked. Then she said nothing else, because she had learned a long time ago that when someone came looking for you at an hour like this, they usually came carrying a sentence with them, and it was better to let them say it on their own. Raphael took an envelope from inside his coat and placed it on the plastic tabletop. It was thick, carefully folded at the edges, with no name written on it. He pushed it across the table with 2 fingers until the edge of the envelope touched the rim of her plate. He told her to take it. He said it wasn't meant to buy anything, and she didn't need to tell anyone about it. He said she was working night shifts in a place that didn't deserve her, and he had a habit of paying his debts in full. Adeline looked at the envelope. She didn't open it. She placed 2 fingers against its edge and pushed it slowly back across the table, without force, until it rested exactly in front of him again. Then she spoke. She said he was misunderstanding something, and she wanted to make it clear so he wouldn't have to come back here again. She hadn't saved those 8 men that night because they belonged to him. She didn't know who they were. No one had told her who they were, and even if someone had, it wouldn't have changed anything. She saved them because they were lying on her tables. That was all. Then she continued, her voice still even, saying that if he had been the one lying on stretcher number 7 that night, she would have done exactly the same thing, step by step, no more and no less. And if the person lying there had been the man who caused the explosion, she would still have done exactly the same thing. It wasn't a favor. It was her job. When she finished, she lifted her coffee cup and took a sip, drinking in a completely ordinary way, as though she had simply repeated a regulation posted on a wall. Rafael Santoro sat in silence. For years he had sat across from judges, bankers, men who wore badges, and men who wore nothing at all. And in every one of those rooms, he had always known what sentence he would say next, because he could always find the thing the person across from him wanted. And once he found it, the rest was only a matter of price. He looked at the woman sitting in front of him, at the coat worn thin around the wrists, at the plate of cold eggs, at the envelope resting between them on the plastic tabletop, and for the first time in many years, he didn't know what to say. Adeline looked at the clock on the diner wall, stood up, put on her coat, and thanked him for coming to tell her about the 8 men. Then she walked out the door. He remained there alone for a while longer. Then he picked up the envelope, slipped it into the inside pocket of his coat, and went outside. Silvio was waiting in the car. He opened the door, Raphael got into the back seat, and Silvio waited for the order to drive. The order never came. The car remained parked at the curb across from the bus terminal, the engine idling softly, warm air blowing from the vents, and the man in the back seat didn't say a single word until the sky outside began to brighten. Silvio came back on a weekend evening, and this time he closed the office door behind him, something he had done no more than 3 times in 30 years. He placed 3 separate files on the desk instead of 1, arranged them side by side, and said that his boss should read them in exactly this order. The first file contained the supply intake and distribution records for Halcyon Row Clinic over the past 18 months, cross-checked against vendor invoices. Raphael turned through several pages, then looked up. Silvio said that the blood, pain medication, and medical supplies disappearing from that facility hadn't been sold off piecemeal, no one was making small money on the side, and there was no trace of the black market operation people would usually suspect first. Everything flowed to one place. He turned to a page with a diagram and placed his finger on a low building in the Western Industrial District, a facility registered under the name of a dental supply company that didn't actually exist, with an operating room, cold storage, and a physician on duty. He said the place served Gideon Brandt's people, that the 11 pages the woman had placed before the oversight board hadn't threatened the career of one clinic director. They had threatened the entire pipeline. Raphael closed the first file. He didn't say anything. Silvio pushed the second one across. It was a field report on the explosion, reconstructed by Santoro's people, with photographs and a floor plan of the warehouse complex. Silvio said everyone had assumed Brandt was targeting the cargo that night. Then he pointed to the diagram. He said the device hadn't been placed near any row of containers, hadn't been placed near a crane, hadn't been placed anywhere close to valuable freight. It had been placed against the eastern wall of Warehouse 4. Raphael looked down at the diagram and didn't move. Warehouse 4 didn't hold cargo. Warehouse 4 was where this organization kept its private infirmary. 2 rooms, 1 sterile area, enough equipment to keep a man alive overnight without taking him anywhere that created a record. It had been there since his father's time. It was the reason that for years no Santoro man had ever had to lie on a stretcher, being pushed through the back door of an unfamiliar facility. Silvio continued, his voice even, as though he were reading from an official report, saying that the device had been positioned to destroy that exact place and nothing more, that the men injured that night had been a delivery crew passing through and not the intended targets, and that when those 8 men needed somewhere to go, their own infirmary no longer existed. He said that night, our people called 7 facilities within driving distance through the snowstorm. 6 refused. Halcyon Row accepted them. Then he said the sentence he had considered carefully for the entire trip there, that Halcyon Row hadn't been our choice, sir. It was the only place left, and it was left because someone wanted it to be. Raphael sat very still. He looked at the 2 files lying side by side on the desk, and in his mind 2 halves of something fitted together like pieces of wood cut for the same joint. First, destroy the only place that could save them. Then force everyone toward a location already prepared, so that no one walked back out. That basement hadn't been some petty act of revenge by a man in a gray suit who hated a nurse for writing a report about him. It was the second half of something whose first half had exploded at Dock 12. His 8 men had been sent down there to die, and the woman had been put there to take the blame. Silvio rested one hand on the 3rd file. He didn't open it. He only said that he had found this while tracing Warren Halloway's history backward, and that he had spent a very long time deciding whether he should bring it here at all. Then he drew out a single sheet of paper and placed it in front of Raphael. It was a faded copy on old paper stock, a form from a public hospital on the west side of the city, the kind of form used to document refusal of admission based on ability to pay. In the patient information section was a name Raphael Santoro hadn't seen on any document in many years, Emmerich Santoro. On the bottom line at the right, inside the box reserved for authorization, there was a signature, and beneath the signature was the printed name of an administrator, who had been very young at the time. Warren Halloway. Raphael said nothing. He picked up the page with both hands and looked at it. And Silvio stood there waiting for an order that 30 years had taught him to recognize before it was spoken. The order didn't come. Instead, after a very long while, Raphael asked one question without looking up, his voice lower than usual. "Does Brandt have this paper?" Silvio answered that Brandt had it before his boss even knew Halloway existed. Raphael set the paper back on the desk, and he understood the third layer without anyone having to explain it. You didn't recruit a man like Halloway with money. You recruited him with something like this. This was the chain, and someone had been holding it for years, waiting for the right night to pull. And if Raphael sent men after Warren Halloway tonight, if by tomorrow that man was gone, Gideon Brandt would lose nothing but a link that had already outlived its usefulness, while the Santoro name would appear in a criminal file, with a motive so obvious that no further investigation would even seem necessary, and everything his father had left behind would pass into someone else's hands within a season. That was the second trap, and it had been set before the first trap ever closed. Silvio asked what his boss wanted him to do. Raphael said nothing at all, and told him to go home. Silvio left the room. The lights in the office stayed on all night. The driver waited downstairs in the lobby until morning, and was never called up. When dawn began to break, the paper was still lying on the desk, and the man sitting in front of it still hadn't touched it a second time. Warren Halloway didn't wait for anyone to come looking for him. He filed a petition with the state medical board on Monday morning, and he submitted it with every appendix attached, because a man who had spent his entire career living by paperwork understood that the best weapon was always the one your opponent had created with their own hands. The petition stated that during that night shift, Nurse Adeline Mercer had performed a procedure entirely outside the scope of nursing practice, specifically arranging the direct transfer of blood from one person to another, without physician supervision, without screening according to established standards, and without written documentation of consent. Attached to the petition were recorded statements from 2 employees who had been present, an inventory sheet from the supply cabinet showing that a box of blood typing strips had been used, and a photograph of the whiteboard, with 2 names circled in her own handwriting. He didn't need to invent a single line. Everything in it was true. That was what made it perfect. The board issued a temporary suspension pending review, and because no facility was willing to schedule a nurse whose case was under review by the board, Adeline Mercer lost the last nursing job she had left that same afternoon. They allowed her to go upstairs to the locker room and collect her belongings, and an administrative employee went with her, standing at the door with a clipboard in hand, saying nothing. She didn't have much. A spare pair of shoes, a mug, a roll of colored tape that hadn't been used up, and 3 hardbound notebooks filled from cover to cover. Everything fit inside a cardboard box of the kind the supply department used for printer paper. She left through the front entrance. The southbound bus picked her up at a stop 2 blocks away, and there were only 4 people on it that afternoon. She sat in the 3rd row with the box resting on her lap, both arms wrapped around it in the way people hold something they don't want sliding onto the floor when the bus breaks. Outside the window, snow had begun falling again, not as heavily as it had that night, only small flakes driven sideways by the wind, drifting diagonally across the glass and disappearing from view before they seemed to touch anything. She looked outside for the entire ride. She didn't cry. The woman sitting in the row ahead turned once to look at her, then turned back around. In the days that followed, Adeline still came to Halcyon Row. She came as nothing at all, with no employee badge, no name on the shift board, and no one upstairs knew she was there because she only sat in the small procedure room at the far end of the 1st floor corridor, on a plastic chair pushed against the wall, both hands resting in her lap. Marisol Ferraro did the work. She did it, and Adeline spoke. She talked her through every step, slowly, without skipping a single one, her voice as level as it had been in the basement. Disinfect the outer area again first. Move the clamp a little to the left. You're holding your breath. Breathe out. Don't look there. Look at your hands. Once, Marisol botched a dressing and had to remove it and wrap it again, and she turned toward Adeline with red eyes and said that if it were her, she would have finished a long time ago. Adeline didn't move from the chair. Both hands remained resting in her lap, fingers closed together, motionless. She said that if she were allowed to stand up, she already would have. Then she continued in the same voice, saying that right now her hands were sitting here, while Marisol's hands were on the patient. So Marisol was the important person in that room, not her. Marisol lowered her head and started over. This time she finished it. Adeline didn't praise her. She simply told her the next step. And that was how the rest of the afternoon passed. with Adeline sitting on the plastic chair against the wall in that small room at the end of the corridor, speaking aloud everything her own 2 hands were no longer allowed to do. There was a knock at the door in the middle of the night. 3 knocks, evenly spaced, unhurried. Adeline opened it, and Rafael Santoro was standing in the hallway, one hand gripping his opposite shoulder, his coat draped over his arm instead of worn. He didn't say what he needed. He only said that if he went to a hospital, within an hour there would be 2 uniformed officers sitting in the hallway, and after that everything would go in a different direction. Adeline stood in the doorway and thought about the temporary suspension order lying in the drawer of the dining table inside this very apartment, thought about how all she had to do was touch the man standing in front of her, and she would be handing the board one more line to write into her file. Then she stepped aside. She told him to keep his voice down and take the hallway on the left, because her niece was asleep in the back room and the girl had never once woken in the middle of the night. The kitchen was small, with only one light hanging low above the table, its dull yellow glow falling across a wooden surface where the varnish had peeled away at one corner. Adeline took a flat tin box from the top cabinet, the kind people usually kept cookies in, and when she opened the lid, there were no cookies inside. There was an old set of instruments, neatly arranged on a layer of cloth, each piece resting exactly where it belonged, clean, and clearly wiped down many times by someone who no longer had any reason to use them. Raphael looked at the box and asked nothing. He sat in the chair, turned his back toward the light as she instructed, and for the entire time that followed, he didn't make a sound. Not once. Adeline worked, and now and then she paused for half a beat to make sure he was still conscious, and every time he was. The wallet in his coat pocket fell to the floor when he shifted, sprang open, and several things slipped out. Adeline bent down to pick them up. Papers, a key, and a photograph printed on paper yellowed along all 4 edges, creased straight across the middle from having spent too many years folded inside a wallet. In the photograph, a man stood in front of a fruit stand set up on a sidewalk, wearing a faded apron with his sleeves rolled up, smiling at whoever had taken the picture. Adeline looked at the photograph longer than she meant to. Raphael said 3 words, "That's my father." She put the photograph back into the wallet, closed it, and handed it to him. Then she said that he had the hands of a working man. She said it in an entirely ordinary way, like an observation about the weather, and returned to what she had been doing. Rafael Santoro sat still. For many years, the name Emmerich Santoro had appeared only in 3 kinds of sentences. Sentences spoken by people who wanted to remind Raphael whose son he was, sentences spoken by people who wanted him to remember whom he owed, and the sentence carved into a stone. No one had ever spoken of him simply as a man with hands. After a while, Raphael asked her about that winter. He asked directly, without circling around it, why she hadn't said a single word at the hearing. Adeline didn't stop working. She said that on the second night, the radio had become nothing but static, and the only thing that still came through was the voice of the man on the team beyond the wall, the man who had asked the same question again and again for 2 nights, whether Sparrow could still hear him. She said his name was Theodore Lang. Everyone called him Teddy, and he was the man she was going to marry the following spring. She said her headlamp had died a long time before that, and the last beam of light she had came from him, pushing a lamp through a narrow gap, along with a spare battery and a single sentence. "Just do it. I'll take responsibility. Put in the report that I gave the order." She said concrete dust had fallen continuously for hours, and she couldn't see anything beyond that circle of light. Then she said one more thing and nothing else about that night. She said that person lived. After a stretch of silence, she continued, saying that Teddy went back for the generator a second time, and the second time, no one heard anything else over the radio. She said that when they called her before the board, she had sat there and listened to them read the charges, and she realized that if she opened her mouth to defend herself, she would have to say that someone else had ordered her to do it, and that would mean standing in front of a room full of strangers and shifting part of the responsibility onto a man who was no longer there to speak for himself. She said that at the time, she couldn't do that, that looking back now, she wasn't even sure she had been right. Raphael listened to all of it. He didn't ask another question. When she raised her hand to cut the final stitch, her sleeve slipped below her elbow, revealing the entire burn scar running from her left wrist upward beneath the yellow light. She didn't pull the sleeve back down. She finished cutting the thread, placed the scissors inside the tin box, closed the lid, and washed her hands at the sink. Before he reached the door, she made one thing clear. She said this was the last time. "If you come here again, I'll call an ambulance, and after that you're on your own." Raphael stood in the doorway, put his coat on, and said he understood. Then he left. Adeline closed the door, switched off the low-hanging light above the kitchen table, and stood in the darkness of the kitchen for a while before going back to her room. Silvio found the informant not by following money, because no money had moved through any account at all. He found him by following a hospital bill, a long-term care facility on the northwest side of the city, a private room, an elderly woman who had been there for more than 2 years, and a balance that had accumulated over many months and was suddenly paid in full on the same day by a funeral services company with no real office. The name of the relative who had signed as guarantor was Dov Kessler. Silvio sat down across from Raphael and told him everything in 4 minutes. Kessler had sold the layout and schedule for Warehouse 4. He hadn't sold cargo lists, hadn't sold shipping routes, hadn't sold anyone's name. He had sold exactly one thing: the location and timing of the warehouse that, according to him, was empty at night, and he had believed they wanted to destroy it as pressure, a blow against money, not against people. Brandt's men had told him exactly that. Then they shifted the timing by about 40 minutes from what had been agreed, and the night delivery crew passed through at precisely the wrong moment. Silvio added one final thing, that when the 8 men were wheeled into the basement, Kessler had been lying on stretcher number 2, and that he had spoken to 2 people who had been in the room that night. Both confirmed that at one point, Kessler had regained consciousness and tried to say something to the person in charge of the shift. Raphael sat in silence for a very long time. Then he stood and said, "Let's go." The hospital where Kessler was staying was a small private facility on the west side, on the 3rd floor, with pale green vinyl flooring in the corridor and every patient room door left slightly open. Raphael walked in front, Silvio and one other man behind him, and the sight of 3 men in black coats, moving through a hospital hallway in the late afternoon, made 2 nurses step aside without understanding why they had done it. Room 17 was at the end of the corridor. The door was open, and standing squarely in the doorway was Adeline Mercer. She was holding an IV bag in her left hand, one she had just taken down from the stand to check, and she was wearing ordinary clothes instead of a white coat, because she was no longer allowed to wear one. She didn't step back. Raphael stopped 3 steps away. He told her to move aside. He didn't say it any louder than anything he had ever said to her, and that was exactly what made Silvio, standing behind him, lower his eyes to the floor. Adeline didn't move. She looked straight at him and said, 8 people were wheeled into my care that night. No one told me who they were. No one told me what any of them had done, and I didn't ask, because I didn't have time to ask then, and looking back now, I still wouldn't ask. I walked down that row of stretchers and I decided the order by one thing and one thing only: who was running out of time. I saved all 8 of them. Then she said the last part more slowly than everything before it. If you step past me now and choose one of those 8 people all over again, then what I did that night means nothing, and neither do the other 7. The corridor went silent. Inside the room, the man on the bed was awake and looking toward the doorway, and he said nothing, asked for nothing, only lay there and watched. Raphael Santoro looked over the shoulder of the woman blocking the door and into the room for exactly 1 beat. Then he looked down at the IV bag in her left hand, the only thing she was holding, and at her 2 feet planted on the pale green vinyl floor, straight and unmoving. He turned away. He didn't say another word. He walked back down the corridor, passing Silvio and the other man, without giving any signal at all, and it took both of them a beat before they turned to follow. At the end of the corridor, just before turning into the stairwell, he stopped once without looking back, and Silvio was the only person who saw it. In 30 years standing behind the left shoulder of this man, and the father before him, Silvio Beretta had never seen either of them walk out of a hallway without finishing what they had come there to do. After Warehouse 4 was gone, the Santoro organization moved the men who were still recovering into a low warehouse at the edge of Dock 12, a long corrugated metal building with 2 rows of makeshift beds, and a generator running through the night in one corner. Adeline went there twice a week. She wasn't paid, didn't sign her name anywhere, and she came for the same reason that had taken her down into the basement, because there were people who needed their dressings changed, and no one else there to do it. Otis Bramble drove her in his old pickup truck, and not once did he explain why he had taken on that job. That night, she was working along the inner row of beds, halfway through changing the dressing of the youngest man among them, when a low explosion sounded from the eastern end of the building, not loud, more like something extremely heavy, falling from a great height. The lights went out. The generator stopped. In the brief silence that followed, the entire warehouse heard a new sound: sheet metal expanding under heat, a long groan traveling the length of the roof, and then the smell of smoke came through the ventilation system. Adeline didn't stand up immediately. She finished the final turn of the bandage, secured it, and only then looked up and began giving instructions. Anyone who could walk was to go out through the western door on their own. Take nothing. Don't turn back. Stay along the wall on the left. The men in beds number 3 and number 5 couldn't walk, and she needed 4 people to remain behind. 4 people stayed. The smoke dropped quickly, and the air inside the warehouse began to warm in a way no one who had never been inside something like that could imagine. Not the heat of flames, but the heat of an entire body of air being heated all at once. Adeline told everyone to stay low and breathe through wet cloth. She disconnected the line at bed number 3 herself, clamped it, folded the tubing, tucked it into her own pocket, then had 2 men lift the entire mattress instead of lifting the patient, because it was faster and carried less risk. When they reached bed number 5, the roof above them gave a louder groan, and everyone froze for 1 beat, and Adeline continued in the same level voice she had used in the basement, saying there were 20 steps left. Move. They made all 20 of those steps. Outside was an open yard covered in snow, the wind cutting sideways, and the cold air struck the faces of the men coming out so hard that several of them dropped to their knees where they stood. The organization's vehicles had crowded together at the edge of the yard, 6 or 7 of them, and someone had thought quickly enough to turn them around and switch on every headlight, aiming them into an open space in the middle of the lot. Adeline walked directly into that pool of light and began building a treatment area on the snow. She told them to spread coats on the ground in 2 layers, 2 men to each coat. She told them to take the water from the vehicles, every bit of water in every vehicle, and bring it to her. She told 3 men to stand against the wind and stay exactly where they were, not to move. She divided the snowy yard simply by pointing. This side for the people who could walk, that side for the people who couldn't. And she said that once anyone sat down somewhere, they were to stay exactly there until she reached them. The men obeyed. They were men accustomed to giving orders, not taking them. Men who had stood guard for one another through nights worse than this one. And they obeyed without a single question, because there had already been 1 night in a basement that every one of them had heard about. Otis Bramble stood beside her. He had managed to retrieve the heavy-duty work light from the bed of his pickup, and he held the beam angled downward into the exact place the vehicle headlights couldn't reach, the dark pocket directly beneath her hands. He said nothing. He shifted the beam to the right when she tapped 2 fingers against the edge of a coat, spread over the snow, and raised it when she stood to move to another person. And throughout all of it, not 1 man in that yard asked who he was, why he was there, or why a 61-year-old night orderly knew exactly where to hold the light. Everyone's breath rose in white clouds beneath the headlights. Behind them, the metal roof of the warehouse continued to give long groans, each one different from the last. And every time it happened, a few men turned their heads to look back. Adeline didn't turn around once. She worked through everyone sitting on the left side, then moved to the right, and when she finally looked up to count again, someone called her name from the edge of the yard. She counted the heads inside the headlights. She counted once, then counted a second time, more slowly. Then she stood upright and asked who hadn't come out. The one who answered her was one of the 4 men who had stayed behind to carry the mattresses. He said there was still bed number 7 in the innermost row, and then he said that Kessler had gone back inside. No one had been able to stop him. Dov Kessler had been sitting at the edge of the yard from the beginning, alone and apart from everyone else, because for the past several days everyone had known what he was waiting for, and no one sat beside him anymore. When he heard that 1 person was missing from the count, he stood up and went back through the western door. He moved fast, and the man closest to him managed only to catch the edge of his sleeve. Adeline headed toward the door. Someone grabbed her arm, and she pulled free. Inside, the smoke had grown thick and low, and near the middle of the warehouse, a section of the roof support had dropped and broken at an angle, creating a wedge-shaped opening close to the floor, less than 1.5 feet high, running deep into the interior. A human voice was coming from somewhere inside it. Adeline lowered herself onto the concrete. She took off her outer coat and left it behind, then crawled in. Otis stood at the mouth of the opening, lowered the heavy-duty work light until it was almost touching the floor, and aimed it straight inside, holding it perfectly steady, both hands braced against the concrete so the beam wouldn't shake. Outside, 3 more vehicles had just raced into the yard and stopped crookedly. Rafael Santoro stepped out of the second one. His first few steps were normal. He looked at the men sitting in the snow beneath the headlights. He searched and didn't find what he was looking for, then asked the nearest man 1 short question. The man pointed toward the western door. Rafael went there, and they stopped him 3 steps from the mouth of the opening. 2 men, 1 on each side. And they stopped him not because they dared to, but because there was no room left inside for anyone else. From deep within the gap came the sound of the structure shifting, a long groan traveling along its entire depth before fading away. Raphael called her name. He called loudly. The entire yard turned. In all the nights the men standing there had gone through beside him, at the docks, in glass-walled rooms, in meetings where everything could have gone very badly, not one of them had ever heard this man raise his voice. Not once. And now he was standing in front of a narrow opening less than 1.5 feet high, both arms hanging straight at his sides, calling a woman's name into it, and his voice broke on the final sound. An answer came back, short, distorted by distance and smoke, but it came. She said there were 2 people left, then silence. Otis kept the beam steady. Raphael stood there, and no one in the yard dared say anything to him. The structure groaned again, and this time the sound changed pitch halfway through, and one of the 2 men holding Raphael let go and stepped back. He called her name a second time. There was no answer. The silence stretched. It lasted so long that someone in the yard began counting, without realizing he was doing it. Raphael took 1 step forward, then another, and the second man released him too, and he had already dropped to his knees at the mouth of the opening. 1 hand braced against the hot concrete, his head lowered to the level of Otis's beam, when a sound came from inside. It wasn't a voice. It was fabric dragging across concrete. Then a hand appeared at the edge of the light. Adeline came out first, crawling backward on her elbows, dragging someone behind her by the collar, and that person wasn't moving but was still breathing. Directly behind them, Kessler crawled out using 3 points of support, 1 arm hanging useless, and only after he cleared the opening did he collapse onto the floor. They pulled all 3 of them away from the western door. Adeline sat upright in the snow before anyone had time to help her, coughed twice, then immediately turned toward the man she had dragged out, placed her fingers against his neck, and began giving orders again. She told them to get water. She told Otis to move the light to the left. She told 2 more men to come over. She didn't look up. Raphael Santoro was kneeling in the snow 3 steps away from her, his black coat hanging open, both hands black with soot and grime where they rested on his knees, and he watched her work without being able to say a single word. Silvio stood behind his boss, and he was the only man in the yard who understood that the cry they had just heard had been witnessed by more than 20 people, and that from that night forward, no one in the organization would ever again call Raphael the Cold One with quite the same meaning. The hospital on the west side took in everyone from the warehouse yard, and by the time everything had finally settled, the sky beyond the 3rd-floor corridor windows still hadn't begun to brighten. Adeline sat on the row of plastic chairs along the wall, both hands resting in her lap, dust still clinging to her hair, and she had been sitting there for a long while before Raphael Santoro lowered himself into a chair, 1 seat away from her. He didn't ask whether she was all right. He sat in silence for a while, and then he spoke. And what he spoke about was himself, not her. He said that his father had sold fruit on a street corner on the south side for 22 years, and in all those 22 years, he had never taken more than 3 consecutive days off. He said that when his father collapsed, he took him to a public hospital 4 blocks from their home, and they told him to sit and wait. He said that he waited, that afterward someone came out and told him the facility couldn't admit his father, handed him a piece of paper, and he didn't read it because he was 23 years old at the time and all he could think about was where he had to go next. The second place told him the same thing. By the time they reached the 3rd, they admitted his father, and he went into surgery, and he never came back out. Raphael said that from that day forward, he believed one thing, and he had believed it for many years with all the certainty of a man who thought he had proved it for himself, that people could be bought. Doctors had a price. Judges had a price. Men who wore badges had a price. And the only thing that decided who lived and who died was whether someone had enough money to pay. He said that he had built everything he had on that belief, and it had never failed him once, not 1 time in all those years. Then he turned to look at her, and he said that he had been wrong. He said that night in the basement, no one paid her a single dollar. No one upstairs protected her. And the only thing she got in return was losing the last job she had left, and she did it anyway. He said that she was proof, and that it had taken him 34 years to meet proof like that. Adeline didn't answer. She looked down at the 2 hands resting in her lap, hands that still had concrete dust embedded around the edges of the nails, and at some point the sleeve on her left arm had been pulled back, exposing the burn scar that ran upward from her wrist. Raphael reached across and laid his hand over it. He didn't grip her. He simply placed his hand there, across the scar, and left it there. Adeline didn't pull away. They sat like that for a long time, neither of them saying anything more, until a patient room door opened at the far end of the corridor, and a nurse stepped out to say that the man in room 9 was awake and asking to see someone. Dov Kessler woke up, and the first thing he did wasn't beg for mercy. He told Raphael that he wanted to go on his own. He said he would go to the West District Police Station, that he would tell them everything, where he got the warehouse plans, who his contact was, even the hospital bill. And he asked for only one thing, that no one touch his mother in that private room, because she knew nothing, and she would never understand any of this. Raphael listened to all of it. He said all right, then left the room. Adeline went back to the row of plastic chairs in the corridor and sat down in the same place. Otis Bramble came and sat beside her, in the chair to her left, leaving just enough space between them. He set the heavy-duty work light on the floor between his feet and sat quietly for a while, as though waiting for his words to arrange themselves in the right order. Then he said there was something he had to tell her, something he had meant to tell her for a long time. He said that night in the basement, in the western corner, the stretcher hidden back there. Then he said his son's name. He said his son had been driving for the delivery crew for a little over a year, that he took the night shift because it paid more, and that Otis hadn't known he was in that convoy until the following morning, when someone called him up to the personnel office. Adeline turned to look at him. She couldn't say anything. Otis didn't look back at her. He stared straight at the wall across from them and continued. He said that he went back to work for his next shift, and that he knew people would probably think that was strange, but he hadn't known what he was supposed to do at home. He said that he didn't blame her, that he had been standing 3 steps away, and he had seen her pull the blanket up with both hands, and he had seen the way she smoothed the edge of it over his son's shoulders. He said that all through that night he had stood right there and watched her work, from beginning to end, without missing a single thing, and he knew better than anyone else in that building that she had done everything that could possibly have been done with what she had. Then he said that was why he still held the light for her. The State Medical Board review opened on a late winter morning in a conference room on the 2nd floor of the administrative building, with 5 members seated behind a long table and a clerk at one end recording the proceedings. Warren Holloway sat in the row reserved for the petitioner, one hand resting on a thin file, and he carried himself like a man who had already calculated every possible outcome. He had reason to. The 11-page report she had placed before the clinic oversight board no longer existed anywhere in the clinic's internal records. No paper copy, no electronic copy, not even a line acknowledging its receipt in the document intake log, because he was the person who controlled that log. Without the report, there was no motive. Without motive, that night became nothing more than an understaffed shift in a snowstorm and a nurse who had exceeded the limits of her role. The board read the complaint aloud again. They asked Adeline Mercer whether she confirmed that she had organized the direct transfer of blood from one person to another, without physician supervision. Adeline stood and said yes. They asked whether she confirmed that no written consent had been obtained. She said yes. They asked whether she understood that what she had done fell outside the scope of nursing practice, and she said that she had understood it at the time she did it, not afterward. The chairperson made a note. Warren Holloway's expression didn't change, but the finger resting on his file stopped tapping. Then Adeline said she wished to submit a document. She took an envelope from her bag and placed it on the table before the board. It was a large brown envelope, still sealed, its glued edge never opened, and in the upper right corner was a postal mark stamped in black ink, the date clearly visible. The recipient written on the envelope was Adeline herself, at her apartment address on the south side of the city. She said that she had mailed it to herself on the same day she submitted the report to the clinic oversight board, that she had never opened it since receiving it, and that she was asking the board to open it here, now. Then she added one sentence, without looking toward the seats on the other side. She said that many years ago she had sat before another board with not a single piece of paper in her hands, and since then she had developed this habit. The chairperson picked up the envelope, turned it over to inspect the postal mark, handed it to the clerk for verification, then slit the edge open with a letter knife. Inside were 11 pages. Page 4 contained a reconciliation of the number of O-negative blood units listed in inventory against the number physically counted, with 3 consecutive shortages documented. Page 7 contained a copy of the internal email she had sent, and a brief reply from the executive director's address, stating that the issue had been noted and would be handled at the management level. The date on the email was several weeks before the night of the snowstorm. The room went silent, Warren Holloway stood and said that he objected to the admission of evidence whose source had not been authenticated. And the chairperson replied that the postal mark was authentication, and invited him to sit down. At that moment, the door opened. A very old man entered with a cane, moving slowly, one arm holding a briefcase against his side. He apologized for being late and introduced himself as Ambrose Keller, former chief medical commander of the International Rescue Coordination Team during the structural collapse referenced in the subject's record. He said that over the years he had sent 3 letters to Mercer's former address and had never received a reply, and that not long ago someone had come to find him. He didn't say who. He said that because of that, an application to unseal the records had been filed, and that he had brought a lawfully released extract with him. He placed a small device on the table and asked permission to play 90 seconds. Most of those 90 seconds were static. Then a man's voice cut through, hoarse and decisive, saying that this was Lang, Team 2, and that he was ordering Sparrow to proceed with an emergency procedure outside protocol, that he accepted full responsibility for the decision, and that the communication record should reflect that the order had come from him. The recording stopped. No one in the room said anything. Adeline Mercer remained standing where she was, both hands resting on the table in front of her, and she didn't look toward the device. From the last row of seats, an elderly woman rose to her feet. She wore a gray wool coat, her hair was white, and she had to brace one hand against the back of the chair in front of her to steady herself. She told the board that she was the person who had signed the lawsuit all those years ago, that she hadn't been invited today, and had come on her own. She said she had spent many years hating this woman. Then she said that hatred had been easier, because without it, she would have had to sit down and accept something she hadn't wanted to accept, that her son had already been beyond saving before anyone ever managed to reach him. She said she wasn't asking for forgiveness, because she didn't believe an apology meant very much. She only wanted to say it in a place where someone would put it into the record. Then she sat down. The chairperson asked Adeline whether she wished to add anything. Adeline said that she denied nothing in the complaint, that she had done every single thing described in it, and that she had done those things knowing she wasn't permitted to. Then she said one final thing, that if that night came back again, with that same empty refrigerator, and those same people lying on those stretchers, she wouldn't do anything differently. Those 11 pages didn't remain in the medical board's file. They were forwarded to the district attorney's office, and 3 weeks later, Warren Holloway was indicted on 5 counts, none of them involving an empty refrigerator during a snowstorm, but all tied to a medical supply pipeline that had been operating for more than a year and a half. No one came for him in the night. He was taken away on a Wednesday morning, in broad daylight, by 2 people in plain clothes, while someone in the building stood at a second-floor window and watched from above. Rafael Santoro turned over his portion of the records through his attorney, controlled, conditional, and with nothing in them given away for free. Gideon Brandt's entire transportation network was sealed off within a season, and with it went nearly half of everything bearing the Santoro name, because you couldn't cut one rope without cutting the things hanging from it as well. Some people left, some stayed, and no longer looked at him the way they once had. He explained himself to no one. Silvio Beretta retired at the beginning of spring. He stood in the glass office for the last time with his hat in his hands and said, "I followed your father for 30 years and then I followed you. But this new road is one I don't know how to walk, and I'm old now." Rafael stood and accompanied him all the way to the elevator, something he had never done for anyone else. The state medical board issued its decision, restoring Adeline Mercer's license to practice on a day near the beginning of the month, sending it by certified mail, and she signed for it at the door. That morning, the sky was still dark when she sat down at the kitchen table with a cup of coffee. She sat there for a very long time, and the coffee went cold in her hands without her taking another sip. Then she set the cup down, raised one hand, and pulled the sleeve on her left arm up to the elbow. She remained like that until the light outside the window had grown bright enough to reveal everything in the kitchen, and she didn't pull the sleeve back down. A little while later came the sound of bare feet running across the wooden floor, and 7-year-old Poppy appeared in the kitchen doorway, with one side of her hair sticking straight up, announcing that today she was making pancakes, and her aunt wasn't allowed to help. She climbed onto a chair, poured in more batter than she needed, flipped too early, and the first pancake burned on one side while the other remained almost white. She put it on her own plate instead of her aunt's, looking very serious, and said that whoever cooks has to eat the ruined one. That's the rule. Then she ran off to get a drawing she had folded into quarters the day before, opened it up, and taped it to the refrigerator door with 4 pieces of tape. In the picture was a woman with her hair tied low, wearing a long blue coat the same color as a medical gown, both hands planted on her hips, and behind her was another patch of blue that Poppy explained was a cape flying in the wind. Adeline asked who the woman in the picture was. Poppy said that if her aunt looked at it, she would know, then turned back to her pancake pan. The community clinic opened on an early summer morning in a low row of buildings on the south side of the city, in a space that had once been an auto parts store closed for years and whose entire storefront had to be repainted. On the sign hanging above the door were two names placed side by side, Lang and Mercer, and there was no line explaining who the first name belonged to. Inside, Marisol Ferraro was working in the second treatment room, alone, with no one standing beside her talking her through each step, and she completed her first case before the lunch break. Otis Bramble stood at the entrance in a fully buttoned shirt, holding a stack of registration flyers that he handed to every person who walked in. Adeline stood behind the reception counter, writing names into the ledger. The sleeves of her white coat rolled up to her elbows. Near noon, the door opened, and 8 men walked in. They entered one after another without making noise. The first man leaned on an aluminum cane. The third walked more slowly than the others, with another man close beside him who didn't hold him up, only stayed close. All 8 formed a straight line in front of the counter. No one said anything. The first man placed a small plastic card on the counter, the kind of voluntary blood donor registration card issued by the city blood bank, then stepped back. The second man did the same, then the third, the fourth, until the last one. 8 cards lay side by side on the counter in a neat row. All 8 men stepped back and stood still. In the waiting room, the people who had come for appointments that morning stopped and watched without understanding what was happening. Then, from behind those 8 men, a teenage boy stepped forward. He was about 15, tall and healthy, wearing a t-shirt and carrying a backpack over one shoulder, and he came right up to the counter and placed a headlamp on it. It was very old, the strap faded, the plastic casing scratched on both sides, and someone had wrapped a piece of tape around one of the joints. He pushed it toward her and said that he had kept it for too long, that she needed it more, especially now that she was opening a clinic. Adeline Mercer looked at the lamp lying on the counter among the 8 plastic cards. She stood there with one hand still resting on the ledger, and over the years there had been so many moments when she could have cried and hadn't, in the boardroom, on the bus with a cardboard box in her lap, in the western corner of a basement, in a hospital corridor before dawn, when a man sitting beside her told her the name of his son. This time, she let it come. She stood behind the counter and cried without making a sound, both hands still resting on the ledger, and no one in the room said anything or stepped toward her. Poppy ran out from the back room, slipped between 2 of the men standing there, wrapped both arms around Adeline's waist, and announced to everyone that today was an important day, so everybody had to be happy. A soft ripple of laughter moved through the waiting room. Outside the door, Rafael Santoro stood on the front step with his coat draped over one arm, and he didn't come inside. He remained just beyond the doorway, the way there had once been a night when he stopped behind a strip of colored tape on a concrete floor and didn't take another step. Adeline wiped her face with the back of her hand, looked up toward the door, and called him in. There are things people can take from another human being: a license, a job, a reputation, even the right to touch the thing they are best at. But there is one thing no one can sign an order to revoke: a person's dignity and the choices they make when no one is watching. This story reminds us that behind every ordinary person who passes through our lives, there may be an entire lifetime we know nothing about, and that everyone deserves to be seen before they are judged. Sometimes the kindest thing we can do for one another is simply stand in the right place and hold the light for the person who is doing the work. If today's story touched you, please subscribe to our channel, leave a like, and share this video so we can continue listening to more meaningful stories together every day. How did Adeline's story make you feel? And which character moved you the most? Please leave a comment below. We truly hope to hear the feelings that come from deep within your heart. We wish you and your family good health, a joyful life, and peace in every day. Goodbye, and we'll see you again in the next video.